We continue now with Yogi Ramacharaka's Jnani Yoga. This is lesson 2, Omnipresent Life. In our first lesson of this series, we brought out the idea that the human mind was compelled to report the fact that it could not think of the absolute except as possessing the quality of omnipresence, present everywhere. And likewise, the human mind is compelled to think that all there is must be the absolute, or of the absolute. And if a thing is of the absolute, then the absolute must be in it, in some way, must be the essence of it. Granting this, we must then think that everything must be filled with the essence of life. For life must be one of the qualities of the absolute. Or rather, what we call life must be the outward expression of the essential being of the absolute. And if this be so, then it would follow that everything in the universe must be alive. The mind cannot escape this conclusion. And if the facts do not bear out this conclusion, then we must be forced to admit that the entire basic theory of the absolute and its emanations must fall and be considered as an error. No chain is stronger than its weakest link. And if this link be too weak to bear the weight of the facts of the universe, then must the chain be discarded as imperfect and useless, and another substituted. This fact is not generally mentioned by those speaking and writing of all being one, or an emanation of the one, but it must be considered and met. If there is a single thing in the universe that is dead, non-living, lifeless, then the theory must fall. If there is a single thing in the universe that is dead, non-living, lifeless, then the theory must fall. If a thing is non-living, then the essence of the absolute cannot be in it. It must be alien and foreign to the absolute, and in that case the absolute cannot be absolute, for there is something outside of itself. And so it becomes of the greatest importance to examine into the evidences of the presence of life in all things, organic and inorganic. The evidence is at hand. Let us examine it. The ancient occultists of all peoples taught that the universe was alive. They've always taught it. That there was life in everything. That there was nothing dead in nature. That death meant simply a change in form, in the material of the dead bodies. They taught that life, in varying degrees of manifestation and expression, was present in everything and object, even down to the hardest mineral form and the atoms composing that form. Modern science is now rapidly advancing to the same position, and each month's investigations and discoveries serve only to emphasize the teachings. Burbank, that wonderful molder of plant life, has well expressed this thought when he says, quote, "All my investigations have led me away from the idea of a dead material universe tossed about by various forces, to that of a universe which is absolutely all force, life, soul, thought, or whatever name we may choose to call it. Every atom, molecule, plant, animal, or planet is only an aggregation of organized unit forces held in place by stronger forces, thus holding them for a time latent, though teeming with inconceivable power. All life on our planet is, so to speak, just on the outer fringe of this infinite ocean of force, The universe is not half dead, but all alive. End of quote. Science today is gazing upon a living universe. She has not yet realized the full significance of what she has discovered, and her hands are raised as if to shade her eyes from the unaccustomed glare that is bursting upon her. From the dark cavern of universal dead matter, she has stepped out into the glare of the noonday sun of a universe all alive, even to its smallest and apparently most inert particle. Beginning at man, the highest form of life known to us, we may pass rapidly down the scale of animal life, seeing life in full operation at each descending step. Excuse me. Passing from the animal to the vegetable kingdom, we see life in full operation, although in lessened degrees of expression. We shall not stop here to review the manifestations of life among the forms of plant life, for we shall have occasion to mention them in our next lesson. But it must be apparent to all that life is constantly manifesting in the sprouting of seeds, the putting forth of stalk, leaves, blossoms, fruits, etc., and in the enormous manifestation of force and energy in such growth and development. One may see the life force in the plant pressing forth for expression and manifestation from the first sprouting of the seed until the last vital action on the part of the mature plant or tree. Besides the vital action observable in the growth and the development of plants, we know, of course, that plants sicken and die, and to manifest all other attributes of living forms. There is no room for argument about the presence of life in the plant kingdom. But there are other forms of life far below the scale of the plants. There is the world of the bacteria, microbes, infusoria, the groups of cells with a common life, the single-cell creatures down to the monera, the creatures lower than the single cells, the things of the slime of the ocean bed. These tiny things, living things, present to the sight merely a tiny speck of jelly without organs of any kind, and yet they exercise all the functions of life, movement, nourishment, reproduction, sensation, dissolution. Some of these elementary forms are all stomach. That is, they are all one organ capable of performing all the functions necessary for the life of the animal. The creature has no mouth, but when it wishes to devour an object, it simply envelops it, wraps itself around it like a bit of glue around a gnat, and then absorbs the substance of its prey through its whole body. Scientists have turned some of these tiny creatures inside out, and yet they have gone on with their life functions undisturbed and untroubled. They have cut them up into still tinier bits, and yet each bit lived on as a separate animal, performing all the functions undisturbed. They are all the same all over, and all the way through. They reproduce themselves by growing to a certain size and then separating into two, and so on. The rapidity of the increase in itself is most remarkable. Haeckel says of the monera, he says, are the simplest permanent cytods. Their entire body consists of merely soft, structureless plasm. However thoroughly we may examine them with the help of the most delicate reagents and the strongest optical instruments, we find that all the parts are completely homogeneous. These monera are therefore, in the strictest sense of the words, organisms without organs. Or even in a strict philosophical sense, they might not even be called organisms, since they possess no organs, and since they are not composed of various particles. They can only be called organisms insofar as they are capable of exercising the organic phenomena of life of nutrition, reproduction, sensation, and movement. Verworn records an interesting instance of life and mind among the rhizopods, a very low form of living thing. He relates that the Diflugia ampulla, a creature occupying a tiny shell formed of minute particles of sand, has a long projection of its substance, like a feeler or tendril, with which it searches on the bottom of the sea for sandy material with which to build the shell or outer covering for its offspring, which are born by division from the parent body. It grasps the particle of sand by the feeler and passes it into its body by enclosing it. Verworn removed the sand from the bottom of the tank, replacing it by very minute particles of highly colored glass. Shortly afterward, he noticed a collection of these particles of glass in the body of the creature, and a little later he saw a tiny speck of protoplasm emitted from the parent by separation. At the same time, he noticed that the bits of glass collected by the mother creature were passed out and placed around the body of the new creature, and cemented together by a substance secreted by the body of the parent, thus forming a shell and covering for the offspring. This proceeding showed the presence of a mental something sufficient to cause the creature to prepare a shell for the offspring previous to its birth, or rather to gather the material for such shell, to be used afterward, to distinguish the proper material, to mold it into shape, and to cement it. The scientist reported that a creature always gathered just exactly enough sand for its purpose, never too little, and never in excess. And this in a creature that is little more than a tiny drop of glue. We may consider the life actions of the moneron a little further, for it is the lowest form of so-called living matter. So-called living matter. The point at which living forms pass off into non-living forms, so to speak. This tiny speck of glue, an organism without organs, is endowed with the faculty called sensation. It draws away from that which is instinct, it draws away from that which is likely to injure it, and toward that which it desires, all in response to an elementary sensation. It has the instinct of self-preservation and self-protection. It seeks and finds its prey, and then eats, digests, and assimilates it. It is able to move about by false feet, or bits of its body which it pushes forth at will from any part of its substance, otherwise known as a pseudopod. It reproduces itself, as we have seen, by separation and self-division. The life of the bacteria and the germs, the yeasty forms of life, are familiar to many of us, and yet there are forms of life still below these. The line between living forms and non-living forms is being set back further and further by science. Living creatures are now known that resemble the non-living so closely that the line cannot be definitely drawn. Living creatures are known that are capable of being dried and lay away for several years and then may be revived by the application of moisture. They resemble dust but are full of life and function. Certain forms of bacilli are known to science that have been subjected to degrees of heat and cold that are but terms to any but the specific mind, a scientific mind, that are but degrees of heat and cold that are but terms to any but the scientific mind. Low forms of life called diatoms or living crystals are known. They are tiny geometrical forms. They are composed of a tiny drop of plasm resembling glue, covered by a thin shell of siliceous or sandy material. They are visible only through the microscope. They're so small that thousands of them might be gathered together on the head of a pin. They are so like chemical crystals that it requires a shrewd and careful observer to distinguish them, and that they are alive and perform all the functions of life. These living creatures, well, excuse me, one more time. Leaving these creatures, we enter the kingdom of the crystals in our search for life. Yes, the crystals manifest life. As strange as this statement may appear to those who have not followed the march of science, the crystals are born, grow, live, and may be killed by chemicals or electricity. Science has added a new department called plasmology, the purpose of which is the study of crystal life. Some investigators have progressed so far as to claim that they have discovered signs of rudimentary sex functioning among crystals. At any rate, crystals are born and grow like living things. As a recent scientific writer has said, crystallization, as we are to learn now, is not a mere mechanical grouping of dead atoms. It is birth. It is a birth. The crystal forms from the mother liquor, and its body is built up systematically, regularly, and according to a well-defined plan or pattern, just as are the body and bones of the animal form, and the wood and the bark of the tree. There is life at work in the growth of the crystal. And not only does the crystal grow, but it also reproduces itself by separation or splitting off, just as is the case with the lower forms of life just mentioned. The principal point of difference between the growth and development of the crystals and that of the lower forms of life referred to is that the crystal takes its nourishment from the outside and builds up from its outer surface, while the monera absorbs its nourishment from within and grows outwardly from within. If the crystal had a softer center and took its nourishment in that way, it would be almost identical with the diatom. Or if the diatom grew from the outside, it would be but a crystal. A very fine dividing line. Crystals, like living forms, may be sterilized or rendered incapable of reproduction by chemical process or electrical discharges. They may also be killed and future growth prevented in this manner. Surely this looks like life, does it not? To realize the importance of this idea of life among the crystals, we must remember that our hardest rocks and metals are composed of crystals, and that the dirt and earth upon which we grow and live are but crumbled rock and miniature crystals. Therefore, the very dust under our feet is alive. There is nothing dead. There is no transformation of dead matter into live plant matter, and then into live animal matter. The chemicals are alive. And from chemical to man's body, there is but a continuous change of shape and form of living matter. Any man's body, decomposing, is again resolved into chemicals, and the chain begins over again, merely changes in living forms. That's all, so far as the bodies are concerned. Nature furnishes us with many examples of this presence of life in the inorganic world. We have but to look around to see the truth of the statement that all is alive. There is that which is known as the fatigue of elasticity in metals. Razors get tired and require a rest. Tuning forks lose their powers of vibration to a degree and have to be given a vacation. Machinery and mills and manufactories needs an occasional day off. Metals are subjected to disease and infection and have been poisoned and restored by antidotes. Window glass, especially stained glass, is subject to a disease spreading from pane to pane. Men accustomed to handling and using tools and machinery naturally drop into the habit of speaking of these things as if they were alive. They seem to recognize the presence of feeling in tools or machines, and to perceive in each a sort of character or personality, which may be respected and must be respected, humored, or coaxed in order to get the best results. Perhaps the most valuable testimony along these lines, and which goes very far toward proving the centuries-old theories of the yogis regarding omnipresent life, comes from Professor J. Chunder Bose of the Calcutta University, a Hindu educated in the English universities under the best of teachers, and who is now a leading scientific authority in the Western world. He has given to the world some very valuable scientific information along these lines in his book entitled Response in the Living and Non-Living, which has caused the widest comment and created the greatest interest among the highest scientific authorities. His experiments along the lines of the gathering of evidence of life in the inorganic forms have revolutionized the theories of modern science, and have done much, to further the idea that life is present everywhere and that there is no such thing as dead matter. He bases his work upon the theory that the best and only true test for the presence of life in matter is the response of matter to external stimulus. Proceeding from this fundamental theory, he has proved by innumerable experiments that so-called inorganic matter, minerals, metals, etc., give a response to such stimulus, which response is similar, if not identical, to the response of matter composing the bodies of plants, animals, and men. He devised a delicate apparatus for the measurement of the response to the outside stimulus, the degree, and other evidence being recorded in traces on a revolving cylinder. The tracings or curves obtained from tin and other metals, when compared with those obtained from living muscle, were found to be identical. He used a galvanometer, a very delicate and accurate scientific instrument, in his experiments. This instrument is so finely adjusted that the faintest current will cause a deflection of the registering needle, which is delicately swung on a tiny pivot. If the galvanometer be attached to a human nerve, and the end of the nerve be irritated, the needle will register it. Professor Bose found that when he attached the galvanometer to bars of various metals, they gave a similar response when struck or twisted. The greater the irritation applied to the metal, the greater the response registered by the instrument. The analogy between the response of the metal and that of living muscle was startling. For instance, just as in the case of the living animal muscle or nerve matter, the response becomes fatigued, so that in the case of the metal, the curve registered by the needle becomes fainter and still fainter, as the bar becomes more and more fatigued by continued irritation. And again, just after such fatigue, the muscle would become rested and would again respond actively. So would the metal when given a chance to recuperate. Tetanus, due to shocks constantly repeated, was caused and recovered. Metals recorded evidences of fatigue. Drugs caused identical effects on metals and animals. Some exciting, some depressing, some killing. Some poisonous chemicals killed pieces of metal, rendering them immobile and therefore incapable of registering records on the apparatus. In some cases, antidotes were properly administered and saved the life of the metal. Professor Bose also conducted experiments on plants in the same way. Pieces of vegetable matter were found to be capable of stimulation, fatigue, excitement, depression, poison. Miss Annie Besant, who witnessed some of these experiments in Calcutta, has written as follows regarding the experiments on plant life. There is something rather pathetic in seeing the way in which the tiny spot of light, which records the pulses in the plant, travels in ever weaker and weaker curves when the plant is under the influence of poison, and then falls into a final despairing straight line and stops. One feels as though a murder has been committed, as indeed it has. In one of Professor Bose's public experiments, he clearly demonstrated that a bar of iron was fully as sensitive as the human body, and that it could be irritated and stimulated in the same way, and finally could be poisoned and killed. Among such phenomena, he asks, how can we draw the line of demarcation and say, here the physical ends, and there the physiological begins? No such barrier exists. According to his theory, which agrees with the oldest occult theories, by the way, life is present in every object and form of nature, and all forms respond to external stimulus, which response is a proof of the existence of life in the form. Professor Bose's great book is full of the most startling results of experiments. He proves that the metals manifest something like sleep, can be killed, exhibit torpor and sluggishness, get tired or lazy, wake up, can be aroused into activity, may be stimulated, strengthened, weakened, suffer from extreme cold and heat, may be drugged or intoxicated, the different metals manifesting a different response to certain drugs, just as different men and animals manifest a varying degree of similar resistance. The response of a piece of steel subjected to the influence of a chemical poison shows a gradual fluttering and weakening until it finally dies away, just as animal matter does when similarly poisoned. When revived in time by an antidote, the recovery was similarly gradual in both metal and muscle. Similarly gradual. A remarkable fact is noted by the scientist when he tells us that the very poisons that kill the metals are themselves alive and may be killed, drugged, stimulated, and so on, showing their same response as in the case of the metals, proving the existence in them of the same life that is in the metals and animal matter that they influence. Of course, when these metals are killed, there is merely a killing of the metal as metal. The atoms and principles of which the metal is composed remaining fully alive and active, just as is the case with the atom of the human body after the soul passes out. The body is as much alive after death as during the life of the person, the activity of the parts being along the same lines of dissolution instead of construction in that case. We hear much of the claims of scientists who announce that they are on the eve of creating life. So they call it, from non-living matter. This is all nonsense. Life can only come from life. Life from non-life is an absurdity. And all life comes from the one life underlying all. But it is true that science has done, or is doing, and will do something very much like creating life, but of course this is merely changing the form of life into other forms. The lesser form into the higher, just as one produces a plant from a seed, or a fruit from a plant. The life is always there, and responds to the proper stimulus and conditions. A number of scientists are working on the problem of generating living forms from inorganic matter. The old idea of spontaneous generation, for many years relegated to the scrap pile of science, is again coming to the front. Although the theory of evolution compels its adherents to accept the idea that at one time in the past, living forms sprung from the non-living, so to speak, yet it has been generally believed that the conditions which brought about this stage of evolution has forever passed, But the indications now will point to the other view, that this stage of evolution is and always has been in operation, and that new forms of life are constantly evolving from the inorganic forms. Creation, so-called, although the word is an absurdity from a yogi point of view, is constantly being performed. Dr. Charlton Bastian, of London, England. Dr. Charlton Bastian has long been a prominent advocate of this theory of continuous and spontaneous generation. Laughed down and considered defeated by the leading scientific minds of a generation ago, he still pluckily kept at work, and his recent books were like bombshells in the orthodox scientific camp. He has taken more than 5,000 photomicrographs, all showing the most startling facts in connection with the origin of living forms from the inorganic. He claims that the microscope reveals the development in a previously clear liquid of very minute black spots, which gradually enlarge and transform into bacteria, living forms of a very low order. Professor Burke of Cambridge, England, has demonstrated that he may produce in sterilized ebullient, subjected to the action of sterilized radium chloride, minute living bodies which manifest growth as a subdivision. Science is being gradually forced to the conclusion that living forms are still arising in the world by natural processes, which is not at all remarkable when one remembers that natural law is uniform and continuous. These recent discoveries go to swell the already large list of modern scientific ideas, which correspond with the centuries-old yogi teachings, when the occult explanation that there is life in everything, inorganic as well as organic, and that evolution is constant, is heard, then may we see that these experiments simply prove that the forms of life may be changed and developed, not that life may be created. The chemical and mineral world furnish us with many instances of the growth and the development of forms closely resembling the forms of the vegetable world. What is known as metallic vegetation, as shown in the lead tree, gives us an interesting example of this phenomenon. The experiment is performed by placing in a wide-necked bottle a clear, acidulated solution of acetate of lead. The bottle is corked, a piece of copper wire being fastened to the cork, from which wire is suspended a piece of zinc, the latter hanging as nearly as possible in the center of the lead solution. When the bottle is corked, the copper wire immediately begins to surround itself with a growth of metallic lead, resembling fine moss. From this moss springs branches and limbs, which in turn manifest growth similar to foliage, until at last a miniature bush or tree is formed. Similar metallic vegetation, as we might call it, may be produced by other metallic solutions. All of you have noticed how crystals of frost form on window panes in shapes of leaves, branches, foliage, flowers, blossoms, etc. Saltpeter, when subjected to the effect of polarized light, assumes forms closely resembling the forms of the orchid. Nature is full of these resemblances. A German scientist recently performed a remarkable experiment with certain metallic salts. He subjected the salts of the action he subjected the salts to the action of a galvanic current, when to his surprise, the particles of the salts grouped themselves around the negative pole of the battery, and then grew into a shape closely resembling a miniature mushroom with tiny stem and umbrella top. These metallic mushrooms at first presented a transparent appearance, but gradually developed color, the top of the umbrella being a bright red, with a faint rose shade on the undersurface. The stems showed a pale straw color. This was most interesting. But the important fact of the experiment consists in the discovery that these mushrooms have fine veins or tubes running along the stems through which the nourishment or additional material for growth is transported, so that the growth is actually from the inside, just as is in the case with fungus life. To all intents and purposes, these inorganic metallic growths were low forms of vegetable. But the search for life does not end with the forms of the mineral world as we know them. Science has separated the material forms into smaller forms, and again still smaller. If there is life in the form composed of countless particles, then there must be life in the particles themselves. For life cannot come from non-life. And if there be not life in the particles, the theory of omnipresent life must fall. So we must look beyond the shape and the form of the mineral. We must separate it into its constituent parts, and then examine the parts for indications of life. We're going to end this video right here. We'll pick up with the second half, the second portion of lesson 2, Omnipresent Life, I think. Whatever this one is. Thank you for listening. See you in the next video. By the way, yeah, there it is. What am I doing? Jeez. Good luck.